Have you ever thought about a time when America was building these incredible modern marvels and at the exact same time creating a social disaster? A time of unbelievable wealth and just soul-crushing poverty happening side by side? Well, that's the story of the Gilded Age and the Progressive Era. And today, we're going to unpack how this wild clash of extremes really forged the country we all live in today.
Okay, just picture this with me for a second. The year is 1905. You're standing on a corner in New York City, and the air is just thick with the smell of coal smoke and, well, progress. You look up, and these brand new steel skyscrapers are literally scraping the clouds. It's pure ambition turned into buildings. The whole city is this symphony of noise. You've got the clatter of streetcars, the hum of telegraph wires. It's the sound of a nation just hammering out its future. It feels like anything is possible.
But hold on, just under all that glittering progress, there's a whole different story playing out. Right in the shadows of those incredible skyscrapers, you've got families crammed into tiny, filthy apartments, totally exhausted from working 12-hour shifts for, like, pennies. And then, maybe just a few blocks away, the super rich are throwing these lavish parties that cost more than one of those workers will ever see in their entire life. We're not just talking about a wealth gap here. We're talking about two completely different Americas living right on top of each other. And you can feel it. The tension is about to explode. You know, Mark Twain himself actually came up with a name for this era, and it's perfect. He called it the Gilded Age. See, to gild something means you're just covering it with a super thin layer of gold. It looks amazing on the outside, but underneath, it's usually something cheap or flawed. And that was America. It was glittering with new technology and these unimaginable fortunes. But just under that shiny surface, the whole foundation was cracking from injustice and corruption. So this insane contrast between the promise of America and the grim reality for so many people, it all boils down to one massive question. It's a question that would define the next few decades of American history. And honestly, it's the main question we're going to be tackling here today. And here it is. When people finally got fed up and the backlash came, which we called the Progressive Era, did it actually fix the problems? Or did it just sort of paper over the cracks with a new set of promises? That's what we're here to figure out. Right. So to really get why the Progressive Era was such a big deal, we have to dig a little deeper into the problems it was trying to solve. And these weren't just small issues, growing pains. These were deep, systemic problems that were threatening the whole American experiment. And the problems were literally everywhere you looked. In factories, people were working in deadly conditions for wages that couldn't even feed their families. In the cities, immigrant families were packed into tenements crawling with disease. Politics? Oh, it was a mess. It was run by these corrupt political machines that traded jobs for votes just to keep the same crooked people in power. And out in the business world, you had these massive monopolies or trusts that were just wiping out any and all competition. And all of this was happening while the South was doubling down on brutal racial segregation with its Jim Crow laws. And this quote really just cuts right to the heart of it. The economic engine of the Gilded Age was incredible, no doubt, but it was a machine that was basically fueled by the back-breaking labor of millions of people, while all the profits shot straight to the top, to a tiny, tiny group of elites. For every huge fortune that was made, thousands of lives were being broken. But here's the thing. People weren't just going to take this forever. And out of all that tension and anger, a new movement was born, the Progressive Era. Now, this wasn't some organized single group with a neat plan. No way. It was messy, it was contradictory sometimes, but it was an incredibly powerful groundswell of people trying to tackle these problems head-on. So, where did all this change come from? Well, you can think of it like a three-pronged attack. First, you had the muckrakers. These were journalists who exposed all the dirt, like Ida Tarbell, who took on the giant Standard Oil Company. Then you had the grassroots activists, people like Jane Addams, who built community centers to help immigrants, and of course the suffragettes, fighting for a woman's right to vote. And finally, you had politicians, like the famous Teddy Roosevelt, the trust buster, who decided to use the power of the government itself to fight back against the monopolies. If there was one single idea that tied all these different people and movements together, it was this. At its core, progressivism was this radical belief that society's problems weren't inevitable. They could be solved. It was this deep faith in the idea of progress, that regular citizens and their government could and should work together to build a fairer, better America. Okay, so the progressives had this huge, bold vision, but the big question is, how'd they do? Did all these reforms actually work? Well, this is where the story gets a lot more complicated, and it's where historians still argue today. There are really two big ways to look back at the progressive era. On one hand, you have the view that these guys were heroes. They were visionary reformers who saved America from itself, dragged it into the modern world, and laid the foundation for huge things later on, like the New Deal. But there's another, more critical take. This view says, yeah, they made some changes, but they were pretty modest. They didn't really transform the system, they just stabilized it. And maybe most damning, they almost completely ignored the deep systemic racism that was tearing the country apart. And let's be real, for millions of Americans, especially for Black families living under Jim Crow, but also for tons of immigrants and the working poor, those big promises of the progressive era just didn't come true. Progress was made, yes, but it was a kind of progress that left way, way too many people behind. So, I know you might be thinking, why are we talking so much about something that happened over 100 years ago? Well, because the fights they were having back then, we're still having them today. In fact, you might be shocked by just how familiar it all sounds.
I mean, it's pretty striking, isn't it? The same core questions that Americans were wrestling with a century ago are still right at the center of our political world today.
Just think about the headlines you see every single day. How much should the government be involved in the economy? Are some big corporations just too powerful? How do we make our democracy actually work for everyone? How do we fight for social justice? These aren't new questions. They are the exact same questions our great-grandparents were asking, and we're still looking for the answers. So, in the end, the story of the Gilded and progressive eras isn't just some boring history lesson. It's really like a mirror. It reflects our own time right back at us. It shows us how far we've come, for sure, but it also reminds us just how far we still have to go in that long, long fight to build a better country. The real question it leaves us with is, what's our chapter in that story going to be?